Doing Ksav Sofer as we have every Thursday night, with rare exceptions, since the beginning of the book of Bereshis. And tonight we're doing Haggadah. Ksav Sofer has a parish on Haggadah. That is to say, the collection that I have, Ksav Sofer al HaTorah, includes about 20 pages or more of Haggadah. In addition, though, I have gleaned some selections from his commentary on some of the parshos in the book of Shmos that, of course, are pertinent to the Pesach experience, to the Shibud, to the Geula. So I want to start with Halach Ma'anya. Now, my Haggadah says Halach Ma'anya, but many Haggadot say Kihalach Ma'anya. He seems to say Kihalach Ma'anya, but actually what I want to share with you right now is not dependent on that chaf or otherwise, although some of the Mefarshim explain the significance of it. So we begin the Baal Haggadah, that is to say, the Baal HaSeder, the host, begins and he says, Halach ma'ani da'achila v'asana ba'ar de Mitzrayim. This is, or similar to this, bread of poverty is what our ancestors ate when they were in Mitzrayim, when they were in Egypt. And then he says, Kol dichvin yeseh v'yechal, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. And then he says, Hashata hacha, now we are here, L'shana haba ba'ara di Yisrael, but the next year may we be in the land of Israel. So again, he says, he holds up the bread and he says, like this bread of affliction, that's what we ate in Egypt in our days of servitude. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. And now we are here, but next year in Jerusalem or in the land of Israel. So Ksav Sofer explains, based on the Chovos Halavavos. Chovos Halavavos we mentioned a few times because he quotes him frequently, is a very influential book of Jewish thought, of Musar, ethics, but quite a lot of philosophy there as well. Very seminal work written in the 11th century by a sage who lived in Spain, Bachya ibn Pakuda. So he says, Chovos Halavavos says there are three types of precious. There are three types of abstention, of abstinence. A person who does not indulge in luxuries or even some of the pleasures that perhaps other people seek and enjoy, but he abstains from those things. That's a precious, and that is a fine midah. He says there are three categories. There's precious of a person who katsra yado. He doesn't engage in some of the luxuries and some of the pleasures and some of the indulgences because he can't afford it. He has no money, or he has limited money. So all he has is enough to get by with the basics. He has a humble dwelling and he wears clothing which is of a very basic nature, and he eats food which is inexpensive, and he doesn't have the means. He obviously is not a parush in the sense that he's choosing to exercise self-control. He has no choice. So, of course, that kind of precious is nothing to be especially proud of. He doesn't, okay, he perhaps deserves credit that he's not seeking to acquire wealth through ill-gotten means, but in any case, he gets by with what he has. That's all he has. The second category is a person who is really desirous of some of the indulgences of life, but he is niggardly, he is miserly, and he wants to build up his portfolio instead of spending on things which maybe another person might choose to buy and to consume and to enjoy. Doesn't spend because he wants to stockpile his wealth. It's thrift, not abstinence. Such a person also, even though he has the means, but he's not restraining or exercising self-control because of spiritual or moral reasons, because he realizes that the service of Hashem, if he's always pursuing pleasures of the flesh, whether the bottle, expensive wine, other things, or whatever it might be, he realized, not because he realized it will take him away from Avodas Hashem, but because he's too miserly to spend. The kind of precious, which is praiseworthy, of course, is a person who is within his means. He has the wherewithal, the economic capacity, but he realizes that the way of the Torah is histapek mumuat, is to content oneself with little. And therefore, even though he has the means, but he lives simply, he lives and he is a parush. He's someone who withdraws his hand. He withstands the temptation because he realizes that the way of the Torah is to be mistabek mumwan. And there's a family here in London that I know, a very wealthy family, very charitable family. And although they don't live simply, but they do not live the extravagant lifestyle which their wealth would allow. Relative to their means, they live in a manner which is quite, uh, let's say, quotidian, but they're generous people. I don't want to mention the people, and I'm sure there are lots of people like that. Although that is a madrega, which is something to be admired, I would say. Says Iksav Sofer. An example of that would be what the Gemara says. The Gemara in Tanya says, Hashem says about Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, Kol ha'olam nizon bishvil Chanina beni. All of the world is like provided for. The merit of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa is sufficient to provide for the sustenance of the whole generation. The Chanina beni daila b'kav charuvin me Shabbos to Shabbos. And Chanina himself, he gets by with one kav, like one measure of charuvim. Charuvim is carob. Carob is just about edible. It has some nutritive value, but it's not the tastiest type of fruit around. It's a way of saying he gets by with the bare minimum, but his merit is so great that the whole rest of the world is sustained through him, but he himself does not partake of the bounty that is accessible to the generation in his merit, doesn't partake of it. So that would be an example, says the Ksav Sofer, of someone who's on a very high madriga as a parush. Says the Ksav Sofer, now to get to our subject, Holach ma'anya, how do we sit at the Seder? We wear a kittel, a woman wears her finery, she wears her jewelry, and her appearance is that of a person of means, of affluence, an aristocrat, and we sit at the Seder with our best adornments and the tablecloth and the china and the crystal and the silver in accordance with a person's means. So he is like demonstrating, or at least I would say pretending, he's acting the part as if he is a person of great affluence. And nevertheless, he has all the trappings of wealth, and still he says, Halach ma'an, you know what I'm eating tonight? I'm just eating this very simple bread, the bread of poverty. So he's demonstrating, or at least, as I say, he's play acting, and that's the subliminal message here. He's a parush. He's sitting among the trappings of wealth, but he holds up half a piece of dry matzah, and he says, this bread of poverty, that's what we're eating. But you know what? Even though that's enough for me, I'm saying to all the needy people in this community, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. So he's like that person who is a person of ample means, and he gives generously to others. But for himself, he is content with just that piece of matzah. This idea of the like generous provision for others, it reminds me of what we used to say in yeshiva. I heard it in the name of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, that another person's gashmius is my ruchnius. That is to say, to be concerned for the material well-being of another person, that is something which my spiritual or my moral principles should motivate me to take an interest in it. My own gashmias, that's gashmias. In other words, if I want a new shirt, so perhaps I can get by without the new shirt, or maybe I feel, no, I really do need that new shirt. But for someone else to get a new shirt, for me to give him money so that he can buy a new shirt, that is not a matter of indulgence for me, because I'm caring for the well-being of another person. So that's what Ksav Sofer says over here, that amid the trappings of wealth, he says, I, the Baal HaSeder, I'm just going to eat this piece of matzah, but whoever wants to eat, please come and eat. We have ample food for all of those who are in need. Then he says the following: when we reflect on the trajectory of our ancestors in the land of Israel, they of course, left Mitzrayim. They were at the top of the world. It didn't last that long. Chet HaEgel, subsequently the Chet HaMeraglim. They had to wander for a total of 40 years. They finally entered the land of Israel under the leadership of Yehoshua, and things went well for a while, not such a long while, but ultimately the prophecy of the Torah was fulfilled. Vayishman Yeshurun Vayiv'at, that Yeshurun became corpulent because of wealth, because of prosperity, because of divine blessing and bounty. Vayiv'at, and they rebelled. Their prosperity led them to turn their backs on God, and as a result, they were driven from the land. So says the Ksav Sofer, that's why we say, having invited the hungry, and having indicated I'm getting by just with this piece of matzah for myself, but whoever wants to eat, please come and eat. I want to provide for you. I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to indulge excessively in the wealth and the prosperity that Hashem has given me. And thereby, although we are here in exile now, next year we'll be in the land of Israel, and we will not repeat the errors of our ancestors of ultimately being driven from the land because we're no longer worthy of it. That's how he explains the connection there. Halach ma'anya, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. This year, now we are in exile. Next year, may we be in the rebuilt land of Israel. So that's the first comment I wanted to share. I think a beautiful insight into Halach Ma'anya. And if you remember something from the shir tonight, if you want to share that at your Seder, right at the beginning of the Seder. Okay. Now I want to share with you what he said about Inyan Arba Kosos. Of course, among the very well-known mitzvahs of the Seder and symbols of the Seder is the 4 cups of wine. Now, 1 cup of wine we have in Kiddush. We have 1 cup of wine all the time. On Purim, we maybe have more wine, but we don't have a specification how many cups of wine. As we know, of course, the Seder is the one occasion where we have not 1 cup of wine, but 4 cups of wine. The Gemara in Yerushalmi says that it corresponds to the 4 expressions of redemption. There are other associations as well, but the best known one is with 4 expressions of redemption. V'hotseisi, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. So, says Iksav Sofer, we have to explain what is the significance of each of those expressions of redemption. It would seem they're all expressing broadly the same idea, that Hashem redeemed the Jewish people, gave them their freedom, took them from the servitude of Egypt, and brought them to his service, to the service of God, instead of the service of Pharaoh. What is the significance of each of those from? He explains the following. I'll be brief. He says that shibud, subjugation, of course, is unpleasant. And the more harsh, the more torturous, the more sadistic, the more miserable and desperate will be the plight of the slave. No question about it. But he says in the case of the Jewish people, there was an added component. The added component of heartache was that the Jewish people were invited to Egypt a few generations earlier as honored guests of the crown. Yosef saved Egypt, brought it great wealth, and Pharaoh himself personally should have been, perhaps he was, originally indebted to Yosef. But of course, a new Pharaoh arose. A new Pharaoh arose, did not know Joseph, as a result of which the Jewish people were plunged from the position of privileged aristocrats to the lowest rung, the lowest echelon of society. He says that's v'hotseisi. V'hotseisi is that the double v'hotseisi v'hitzalti, I will take them out and I will take them out and I will save them. It means I will take them out. I will relieve them mitachos sivlos Mitzrayim from the burden. The burden wasn't only the physical burden, but it was the psychological grief and feeling of exploitation, victimization, where I should have been appreciated, and instead of appreciation, I have been exploited. That psychological burden intensifies the suffering. So v'hotseisi, I've taken you out from the burden of Egypt, refers to the psychological burden. V'hitzalti me'avodasam, and I will save you from being subjected and being subservient to the instructions of the Egyptian taskmasters. The third expression, v'ga'alti, he says, the pasuk says, v'ga'alti eschem Bizroa nituya, with an outstretched arm of Amosim, and with great wonders. He quotes Rabbi Lezer, a sefer called Maseh Hashem. Uh, uh, the Belzer Rebbe is descended from him. What's the name of the Belzer? Rokach. Rabbi Lezer Rokach. He quotes him in a sefer called Maseh Hashem. He asks, or he explains, "V'ga'alti eschem b'zroa netuya." What difference would it really make ultimately, if the Jewish people had been freed because Paro let them go, or if they were freed because Hashem extricated them with miracles and with a strong arm? Of course, the latter is a lot more dramatic. It's a little bit of a damp squid, if a little bit anticlimactic. Pharaoh says, "You want to go? Okay, you can go." But he says there's a major difference, because if Paro had said, "You know what? I've subjugated you long enough. You've done some good work here. I'll let you go. Goodbye and good luck. I won't give you a payoff. I won't give you a golden handshake, but I'll let you go." Emancipation proclamation. If that were the case, says Iksavsov, according to the Maseh Hashem, if that were the case, the Jewish people would always have a debt of gratitude. The Egyptians could always say to them, "You know, you were slaves here. We let you go. We did you a favor. We didn't have to. We could have held on to you. We decided to let you go." The Jewish people would always be indebted and would always be subject to that realization. They really were second or third class citizens, and they really had no claim on the Egyptian benevolence, but Pharaoh, because he's such a humanitarian, let them go. That's why the Torah says, "V'galti eschem b'zroa netuya." Paro would not let you go, did not let you go. He was desperate not to let you go. And he was forced to do so because of the strong arm of Hashem. In other words, that when it says "v'galti," that it is emphasizing that Hashem alone took care. Therefore, we don't owe the Egyptians any debt of gratitude at all, just the opposite, of course. Of course, the fourth expression, "V'lakachti," I've taken you to me as a people. The purpose, the ultimate purpose of the Geula was not only the political emancipation, but of course it was to replace the service of Pharaoh to the service of Hashem. "V'lakachti I will take you to me as a people." And in that sense, the Jewish people were exalted and elevated. They were not just like horizontally advancing. Instead of being constrained to live in Egypt, now they can live where they want to live, and they even conquer their old ancient homeland. Much more than that, the Jewish people were elevated vertically. I will take you to me as a people. So this is why we say Hallel Haggadah on the fourth cup of wine. The fourth cup of wine corresponding to V'lakachti, which is the highest level, because you have now, Hashem said, "I'm taking you to me as a people." So that's why we say Hallel Hagadol, the great Hallel, because we are full of appreciation and full of recognition that our circumstances have been totally transformed. We've been elevated, and we are now the people of Hashem. That's what he says about Arba Kosas. Let me tell you now about the Chacham Mahu Omer. So, he asks, "Ma'u chukim ve'edus v'mishpatim." What are all of these things? Explain them to me. So the Ben Chacham, the wise son, of course, reflecting his wisdom, asks a sophisticated question. He asks about all the different aspects, and much has been said about that, all the other four sons as well. Aksav Sofer says as follows. He is asking, by asking all the details about the chukim, the eidos, the mishpatim, he wants to know all about it. In other words, he is a person of intellectual capacity and motivation, and he desires and he aspires to Torah wisdom and to serving Hashem at a high level. So maybe he's a young boy, maybe he's only 8 or 10 years old. You know, he's a son, after all. Could be he's an adult as well, but maybe he's quite young. But he wants to know because he aspires to spiritual achievement. So if that's the case, he wants to know about how can I work towards spiritual greatness. So we tell him, tell him about the laws of Pesach. We don't eat dessert after the Korban Pesach. Now, compared to the sophistication of the question, the answer seems to be pretty simplistic. Yeah, it could well be that the Haggadah is only mentioning one aspect of it, and really such a sophisticated question for a capable and motivated inquirer requires an extensive answer. That's probably true. But still, in what way does this answer encapsulate or represent, somehow, how does it stand in to symbolize, to represent the sophisticated answer that the Baal Haggadah gives to this Ben Chacham? So says Iksav Sofer as follows: the reason that we don't have dessert after the Korban Pesach, or nowadays when we don't have the Korban Pesach at all, but we eat a final piece of matzah, which recalls and symbolizes the Korban Pesach. And of course, as you know, we call it afikoman. Afikoman really means dessert. So we call it afikoman. It is the piece of matzah that we eat that reminds and stands in for the Korban Pesach. And after we eat the Korban Pesach, one was not supposed to eat anything else. And similarly, after we eat that piece of matzah, which we call afikoman, we don't eat anything else because that is the dessert. Which means that if you would like to serve dessert at the Seder, that's fine, but you've got to serve it before the afikoman, because what we call the afikoman is itself the dessert. We don't eat after that. What's the significance of it? So the reason that we don't eat after the Korban Pesach is that the taste of the Korban Pesach should linger in a person's mouth. Shouldn't be something which he eats and the Korban Pesach he eats, and then he goes on to eat other things and he's forgotten about it already. Like you go to a nice restaurant or a wedding feast, and each course is wonderful, and by the time you finish, I won't say you've forgotten what you ate earlier, but you don't have the taste, the enjoyment that you had in the earlier part of the meal. That's a very simple level. There's something much more significant here, halachically, and we'll see the symbolism in one moment. Halachically, the reason we don't eat anything after the Korban Pesach is the Korban Pesach is not the first course of the meal. The Korban Pesach is the last course of the meal. Why? What's the difference? Usually, if a person has a mitzvah to do, it's best to do it first. Don't kind of prevaricate or take a meandering path and do a number of other activities before you do the mitzvah. What's special about Korban Pesach is it is ne'achal al hasova. The Korban Pesach has to be eaten when you're no longer hungry, when you no longer have a strong appetite. So therefore, first we eat other things, and the Mishnah talks about what other things to eat. Of course, you have the matzah, we have the mora. In ancient times, they had the korban chagiga, and then when a person is no longer that hungry, then he eats the korban pesach. That's why I said we don't eat dessert after the korban pesach, because the korban pesach is the dessert, because we've eaten the main part of the meal before. Why not? Why not say, let's eat it with gusto? And here we get to the answer. Because when a person eats with appreciation and with gusto, when a person is hungry and he eats, naturally he feels the pleasure and the satiation of the food that he's enjoying. What about the mitzvah? What about the kavana l'shem shamayim? What about the recognition that by eating this lamb, he's fulfilling a commandment of the Torah, and he's recalling the Exodus and recalling the servitude and recalling the redemption. So if a person is focusing on, wow, how hungry I was, I'm glad I'm enjoying this lamb, it's fantastic, then he's focusing on himself. He's thinking about what this lamb does for me, instead of how am I honoring Hashem by eating this lamb. Says Iksav Sofer. That's why we tell him the Korban Pesach is not eaten when you're hungry. You eat the Korban Pesach not really because you're hungry. You're not really that hungry anymore at all. You eat it because of the mitzvah. And that is true for all the mitzvahs in the Torah. There are many mitzvahs in the Torah where a person can get some kind of personal satisfaction or pleasure, whether like food, like it's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. It's a mitzvah of procreation is a mitzvah. There are a lot of activities which give a person pleasure, which he maybe is motivated to do for any number of reasons, that also happen to be a mitzvah. And even mitzvahs where there's no obvious benefit, like giving charity. I thought, giving tzedakah, there's no hanas haguf, there's no physical pleasure in giving charity, but there is psychological pleasure. There is sometimes a feeling of self-congratulations. There can be even an element of encouraging others to give by my giving, and people admire me for giving, and they're motivated to do the same. Now, those motivations or considerations are not wrong, but they're not the highest level. The highest level is that a person should do the mitzvah because it's the will of God. So that is why we answer the Ben Chacham, who wants to know how to serve Hashem. We answer him by saying the paradigm for all the mitzvahs is that when you do the mitzvah, don't focus on how it makes you feel or what pleasure it gives you, even though it's proper that a person should enjoy doing a mitzvah. But ultimately, the high level is I'm doing the mitzvah because it's the will of God. I'm doing the mitzvah because this is the purpose for which I was created. This brings me closer to Hashem. This brings my conduct in consonance with the divine plan for the universe. That's the answer that we give to the Ben Chacham who's asking a sophisticated question. How do I aspire? How do I achieve a high level of Avodas Hashem? That's what we answer him by saying that the Korban Pesach, if a person were to eat it when he's very hungry, it's hard to focus only on the mitzvah. Therefore, we eat the Korban Pesach when we're not that hungry, and it's easier to concentrate our thoughts on the purpose of the mitzvah. Okay, let's talk about the Ben Rasha. And I want to share with you in the minutes we have left two approaches that Ksav Sofer tells us about the response or the question and the response to the wicked son. So he asks, Ma ha'avoda hazos lachem? What is this service to you? And the word avoda, even though it means service, like divine service, avodas Hashem, Torah va'avoda, avoda shebelev, which is prayer. But as we know, the word avodah also means work, like avadim hayinu. I mean, that's the whole transition, the whole change is from being slaves to Pharaoh to avodas Hashem, but it's the same word, really. So when he says ma ha'avodah zos lechem, he's like mocking, and he's saying, you're doing this service of God. As far as I'm concerned, it's just hard work. Who needs it? Ma ha'avodah zos lechem. And of course, because he says lechem, to you, so we respond by saying that by his addressing the father, let's say, and asking, what is his work that you're doing? He's excluding himself. And we say, indeed, if you had been there, you would not have been redeemed at all. Okay, that's a harsh response. So Ksav Sofer has two approaches, which I want to share with you, each of them. He has more than two, actually, but these are the two that I want to share. He says that the meaning is like this. The wicked son says to his parents, he says, why are you doing this avoda about the Korban Pesach? You've got to choose it, you've got to check it has no blemishes, and you've got to slaughter it, you've got to drain the blood, you've got to take out the entrails, you've got to roast it. Get the household staff to do that. Get the kitchen staff to do that. You eat the meat. You shouldn't be involved. Why are you engaging in all of these aspects of the preparation of this lamb? You want to have roast lamb, then tell your kitchen staff that that's what they should do, and you sit and when it's prepared, you come and eat. That's what he asks. Why are you doing this avodah yourself? Get somebody else to do it. So the answer is that, you know what? Ba'avuza asa Hashem li. That Hashem himself descended into Mitzrayim, like it says, Ani v'lo malach, ani v'lo ashaliach. I am not a seraph, not an angel, not a seraph, not an emissary, but Hashem says, I myself. Hashem himself descended into the impurity of Egypt. It was Hashem who distinguished between who is a firstborn and who is not a firstborn, which is a Jewish home, which is an Egyptian home. And therefore, since Hashem, so to speak, troubled himself to come to Egypt to help us, to do for us, he did it directly, so to speak. Now there's more effort for Hashem in one or another, but nevertheless, from our perception, we have the appreciation and with the recognition that Hashem did it for us. It's in the category and the sort of formula of ani ledodi v'dodi li. I am to my beloved as my beloved is to me. What Hashem did for me, he showed his love for me. I show my devotion to Hashem in the same way. And that's why I am doing this avoda myself. When I was learning this, I wrote in the margin, this is a bit of a kasha on the Pesach hotels, where a person actually does go to the hotel, and all the kitchen staff are busy hours and hours a day and night, and he taka sits at the table, and the waiting staff bring him his meat and everything else, the wine, and I've been to a Pesach hotel a few times, not as a guest, but as a kitchen hand in the mashgiach role. But obviously, I oversaw the kitchen activity. I saw the people in the kitchen, they work hard. The guests, they don't work that hard. Okay. So according to Sofer, I guess they didn't have Pesach hotels in his day. The response to the Ben Rasha is, this is why I get involved in the preparation and the effort, because Hashem did the same for me. The same is true, says Iksav Sofer, in other mitzvahs as well, whether building a sukkah or preparing for Shabbos. It's all about chivuv mitzvah. And he, of course, doesn't appreciate the mitzvah. He just wants to enjoy the benefits. And we say to him, you've got the wrong end of the stick, my friend. Okay, its time is almost up, but I would like to share with you one last point. I know we've been rushing a bit, but after all, Seder night is a very important night. We've got two of them in Chutz La'aretz, so here's a final thought to share with you, also on the subject of the question of the Ben Rasha. And here, Ksav Sofer looks at it from a different point of view. When he says Mavor Hazos Lachem, he is speaking to his parents, to the elders. He's a child, maybe an older child, maybe a teenager or a young adult, let's say. But he's addressing the father or the mother, or maybe the grandparents, the older generation. He's got chutzpah towards them. He says, Ma'avod azos lachem, what are you guys doing? Why are you wasting your time with this stuff? Who needs it? So says Iksav Sofer, we say to him, if you had been there, you would not have been redeemed. Why not? Because the Jewish people in Mitzrayim, we know that they were not devout any longer. They had squandered the legacy of the patriarchs. They had become Egyptians, maybe second or third class Egyptians, but they had taken up the idolatrous cult of the Egyptians, as we know, as the Chazal teach us. One thing they had some derech eretz for the elders. When Moshe and Aharon came with a message from God, so the pasuk says, "V'ya'amein ha'am," the people believed them. In other words, they were theologically challenged. Theologically, in terms of belief in God, they had lost it, but they still had the derech eretz. They still had the respect for their elders. I think that Ksav Sofer here is alluding to the young people of his own times who were, in many cases, influenced by the changing times, by the Haskalah, by the Enlightenment. And whereas the older people were more traditional and were more like inclined to maintain the traditional Jewish ways, but the younger generation, in many cases, were not. So says the Ksav Sofer, that's why we say it's ba'avur because they had our ancestors had kvod zakenim, they had respect for their elders. So that's why there was hope that they could get their act together, which eventually they did, although it didn't last, but they did get their act together in sufficiently to believe in God. So he says that, but if they had followed your example, where you've got chutzpah and you have no respect for your elders, you would not have been redeemed. They would also not have been redeemed. You would not have been redeemed either. So, and then he says, just along these lines, finally, he says, maybe this is why the Chazal say, because they were not Ba'alei Lashon Hara. One of the merits that the Jewish people had is they did not inform on one another. That's why Moshe was shocked when he realized that the Dasan and Aviram, who had witnessed Moshe's knocking off the taskmaster the previous day, that they were prepared to report him and to turn him over to the Egyptian authorities. So he said, Achenu dahadavar, but for the most part, the Jewish people were not guilty of Lashon Hara. So says Ksav Sofer, this penchant to mock and to scorn those who do mitzvahs, at least that the Jewish people did not have in Mitzrayim. Maybe they didn't keep the mitzvahs themselves, but they didn't scorn those who did. But this Ben Rasha, this contemporary Rasha, he is worse because he's scorning and mocking the elders who are engaged in the avoda. And we have nowadays certainly a similar phenomenon where you have websites, Jewish websites, which are devoted to scorning and mocking and essentially demeaning rabbis and others. Now, I am well aware that in some cases the derision may be deserved, sadly, but nevertheless, we find many rabbanim are very opposed to this habit, especially they're mostly anonymous, where it's very easy for a person to go online and to spread very, malicious or malevolent allegations about other people, including rabbis, including distinguished rabbis, and to mock and to deride and to scorn them. So according to Ksav Sofer, even without the reference to social media and Facebook and those kinds of things, the Ksav Sofer says something quite similar here. He says, according to this approach, Mahavod Hazos Lachem, that he is mocking his elders, and they say to him, it's because our ancestors respected Moshe and Aaron. They had the derech eretz at least, and that's why they were redeemed. But with your penchant for derision and mockery and scorn, you would not have been redeemed. So those are my thoughts to want to share with you. Maybe we just summarize quickly. We said halach ma'anya, that this reflects the proper form of precious. The Baal Haggadah, the Baal HaSeder, I'm sorry, the host has all the trappings of wealth, but he says, for me, I'm just eating this matzah. But anyone who is hungry, please come and eat. I want to provide for you. And in that merit, he says, look, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to be led astray by the prosperity. And in that merit, we hope to return to the land of Israel. We said about the 4 cups of wine, how the Jewish people were exploited psychologically. In other words, their suffering was not only because of the labor, but because in their hearts they knew that it was completely undeserved. They had been exploited by people who should have respected them and should have appreciated them. But so that was a further form of torment that they suffered. And we said that the V'ga'alti, that I took the Jewish people out through Hashem's effort. Hashem's with a strong arm. Paro didn't let you go, because if he had, you would always have a debt of gratitude to him, or he could always say, you know what, you never paid me, I just let you go. It was out of the goodness of my heart. He did not let them go out of the goodness of his heart. He did not let them go at all. Hashem compelled him ultimately to do so. And so the Jewish people were elevated. Then we said the Chacham asks about all of the details, the different types of mitzvahs, chukim, mishpatim, eidos, etc. And we answered to him that we don't eat anything after the Korban Pesach, meaning that the proper way to do a mitzvah is not because it gives you personal pleasure, you're hungry, that's why you want to eat, but rather you do it l'shem shamayim, for the sake of the mitzvah itself. And then lastly, we said about the Ben Rasha, 2 different approaches. We said that one approach is, he says, why are you doing all this work? Get the kitchen staff to do it. You sit down and eat meat. And the answer is, Hashem did it for us himself. We also get involved l'chivuv mitzvah because of the love of the mitzvah ourselves. And then the last thing we said is that he says, Ma'avarozos lachem, he's like mocking his elders, and we say to him that our ancestors at least had the decency, the derech eretz. When Moshe came, vayamenam, they accepted him and they were respectful towards him. Again, it may not have lasted that long, but at least initially they were. And if you had been there with your impulse to scorn and to mock those who are older than you, you would not have been redeemed. So maybe we shouldn't end on that kind of a down note, but that's all we have time for. So those are the comments that I want to share with you tonight. Wish everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.